Well, welcome back to the latest episode of Near and Rufar, our weekly live stream. I'm David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot, a site devoted to elections all up and down the ballot. And joining me is my co-host, Aaron Rupar, the publisher of Public Notice, a site devoted to telling the truth about the stories making news nationally. Well, we have been consumed with one story in particular, even though there are, as is always the case in any Trump era, tons and tons of stories making massive news. Last week, we titled our episode, Democrats Are Winning the Shutdown. And this week, we sort of flip the script and the
Mhm.
Republicans are losing the shutdown. And I feel like that might seem like a different a distinction without a difference, but there really is, because last week I feel that I was basing that conclusion on the early polls showing that that the public by and large blamed Republicans far more for the government shutdown than Democrats. But now in the past week, it seems like there's been a lot of reporting indicating just how badly Republicans underestimated Democrats and misjudged the situation, expected them to fold and collapse and to not stand strong like this. And boy, Democrats, I got to say, I'm a little bit surprised, have really shown Republicans how wrong they were.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought a good illustration of this today was Mike Johnson's press conference. He's been doing kind of daily gaggles with reporters in the morning. And, a lot of it is kind of the same where he's holding firm on his demand that there basically is no negotiation, that Democrats just pass the clean CR. But even Jake Sherman, at Punchbowl, who's one of the most plugged in DC reporters, was remarking today that Johnson seemed a lot angrier than normal, where I think
Huh.
Sherman even noted on Twitter that he was pounding the podium at one point. And I was posting clips. I didn't notice him pounding anything, but you could tell that, and some of it with him is kind of performative as well with Mike Johnson. Like, he's been using this side like the last couple of days about how angry he is and how fed up, and how he's normally a calm person, but you just can't take these Democrats playing political games anymore. And so it's kind of a little bit hard to separate the performative nature of a lot of his actions with, what he's really feeling, or sincerity. But, he has, I think, gotten a little more angry with reporters. And I think that, kind of reflects that they're not playing a great hand of cards right now, where, as you mentioned, the polling is a little difficult to interpret in the sense that it's like basically who is getting more of the blame is kind of the measurement by which we're evaluating who's winning or losing. It's not like, there's been this swell of support necessarily for Democrats' position, because, broadly, it seems like the polling that's been done, people aren't happy with the government being shut down. There'll be more of that in the days to come as, for instance, air traffic control is more impacted, or, in a week or so, I believe that members of the military will stop receiving paychecks, then other federal workers might stop receiving paychecks or be laid off. So there's going to be more consequences and harm, to everyday Americans as this gets deeper and deeper. But the polling that has been done, as you kind of alluded to, David, has shown that the Republicans are taking the brunt of the blame much more so than Democrats. And, I've noticed that Jeffries initially was really out there a lot, doing all sorts of TV hits, doing press conferences, and he's still doing some of that. But it seems like he's kind of dialed it back a little bit, maybe,
Hmm.
realizing that they're in a stronger position, and you have Johnson kind of out there filling the void. And, this is another thing that I've really noticed. And, I wonder if other people have kind of picked up on this as well, is that, Johnson has typically been pretty careful with the media hits that he does. Like, they're usually very controlled. He's on Fox, he's on Newsmax, they're friendly. But, I think he's been a little bit exposed over the last week or two for not being great at taking questions from
Hmm.
reporters. I mean, for instance, today, this was actually on Fox where this happened, but then he kind of doubled down on it later, where he was calling some of the protesters next week for the No Kings protests, basically terrorists, saying that they're pro-Hamas, they're Antifa. I saw a lot of people criticizing that because it's basically attack, obviously, on the First Amendment. And there was another question that he took just moments ago before we went live, where he was asked about rescissions in the context of these shutdown negotiations. And his response basically confirmed every criticism that Democrats have made of Republicans, where he said, we have $37 trillion in debt. One way in which we're going to address this is through a rescissions package. Well, that's the entire problem, because why would Democrats make a deal with Republicans if Johnson is just going to turn around and strip out the parts that he doesn't like with help from OMB, and basically kind of, tear up the deal. So, I've kind of gotten the sense that maybe part of the annoyance is that, he's kind of struggling to field questions from reporters that aren't friendly. And even when he's on friendly channels, speaking to friendly audiences. He's having a penchant increasingly to kind of put his foot in his mouth. And so, I think the facts on the ground haven't changed a lot from where we were at last week. The negotiating positions are kind of similar, where you have Republicans basically saying we're not going to negotiate at all, Democrats saying, we need some concessions on healthcare. But, I think as this has gone longer and longer, it seems like the pressure is getting more to Republicans. And, again, we'll have to see once the members of the military stop being paid. Of course, that's going to be a big pressure point. If we see even more delays with air traffic or, God forbid, any sort of like safety incident, I think that could kind of force people's hands. But my sense is that Democrats are happy to kind of let this play out. And, it seems like the political blowback is mostly hitting the Republicans.
Just as a reminder, if you are a paid subscriber either of Public Notice or the Down Ballot, or ideally both, you can ask us questions in the comment box at the bottom. We love to take your questions. Also, if you have any funny comments, we might just read those out as well. Eric, I want to ask you something. You mentioned rescissions package, and rescissions is one of those very beltway kind of terms of parliamentary term. What exactly does that mean? And I'm asking not just for the sake of our viewers, but because I need a little bit of a refresher on how that all would work.
Yeah, so I mean, a good example that we already have encountered this year was, there was a spending bill earlier in the year that funded public broadcasting. A couple months after that passed, Republicans basically, with the help from OMB, stripped that out, all the funding from public broadcasting. So a rescission is you make a deal that's going to fund X, Y, and Z, and then in this case, the administration, with the help of the compliant Republican majorities, basically says, well, we're taking out X, which we appropriated money for. And so, it's just kind of bad faith negotiating where, you want to believe that when you make a deal with someone, they're going to follow through on their commitments. Republicans, they couch this in the need to reduce spending, but it's like a very kind of underhanded way to reduce spending. I mean, it'd be one thing, to kind of go through the process of, okay, we're going to cut funding for X, Y, and Z, and let's get a vote to do that. And maybe Democrats wouldn't have the votes to block that. And that'd be one thing. I mean, that's normal politics, but it's kind of this dirty dealing where, I think this is where some of the political peril comes in for Republicans. But I think people kind of have an intuitive sense that if you make a deal with someone, even if it's, your spouse to wash the dishes, and then you don't wash the dishes, well, you're kind of being a jerk in that scenario. Like, you're not operating in good faith. You're not following through in your commitments. And not only are Republicans doing that, but, they can't help themselves from telegraphing that they're doing this. And so, this has been part of the broader conversations here, because obviously it's one thing to arrive at a deal to end the shutdown, but it's another thing to have actual assurances that Republicans will follow through on whatever they agree to. And, again, Mike Johnson today in front of reporters with cameras, with this being broadcast on C-SPAN, is saying we're not going to follow through on the deal, even if, we reach it with Democrats, paraphrasing, but that's basically the spirit of what he's saying. And so why would, we talked a little bit about this last week, but why would Democrats make a deal under those conditions? And so, I did see Catherine in the comments here a little bit higher up, which is on topic here, noted that, this kind of encapsulates some of the things I've already been talking about, where Mike Johnson yesterday went on C-SPAN for their morning show where they take live calls from people. And, I saw a few people remarking, and I had this thought too of what were his aides thinking and allowing him to do this, because it was really brutal. He had one question from a military spouse,
Right.
basically was saying there's no reason that you couldn't get the House back in session, even just to vote on a standalone bill to pay the troops, and he really didn't have his response to that has been, well, we already voted to pay the troops with the CR that the House passed.
Right.
There was another caller who pointed out that this spin that Johnson has been offering with the deployments, Trump's National Guard deployments in various cities, that I think the direct quote was that, his spin is insane and dystopian when you see how these cities are actually responding to these deployments. So he just took a series of kind of blistering questions. And, he's an able enough politician where there weren't any individual moments that were total disasters for him, in the sense that he was able to at least kind of revert to his talking points and kind of, it wasn't like it derailed the segment or anything like that. But these are not questions that he usually faces, even from, Beltway reporters who go to his press conferences. I mean, there was kind of emotion and, sort of humanized some of these issues in a way that I don't think reflected well on him. And so, Jeffries has had a strategy of kind of more is more, in the sense that he's been doing all of these various podcasts. He's been going on MSNBC. He's been talking to reporters that are broadcast on C-SPAN for little gaggle. And, I think he's been doing a pretty good job. Even Schumer has had a few zingers, but Johnson just constantly seems kind of uncomfortable. That's not even to bring up kind of the whole issue of the fact that the House hasn't been in session because they don't want to seat the Arizona representative elect who would be the decisive vote on the Epstein discharge position, which he's never had a good response for. I mean, he went on News Nation this week, which is kind of a right leaning cable network. So, again, not like going on MSNBC or anything like that. And basically the host, committed the sin in Republicans' eyes of asking some follow-up questions and, and pressed him on the disparity between Grijalva, the representative elect in
Yep.
Arizona, and the two Florida Republican representatives who won special elections earlier in the year, where they, in the same kind of pro forma session when the House wasn't officially in session, were seated. And so why were they seated? And Grijalva, he's refusing to seat her. And his response was, the two Florida representatives had made plans to have their families there. And so in order to do all their family was there. Yeah.
Please.
Yes, I know. I mean, I encourage people to go find the clip because I posted the whole kind of 3-minute back and forth. And by the end of it, Johnson was reduced to just kind of reiterating, this is a distraction. This is a distraction. It's not about Epstein. But, I mean, so it's not just the shutdown issue and kind of the underlying healthcare policy debate. It's like just the fact that he is transparently not being honest about what's going on with Grijalva, with the fact that the House isn't in session. There's no reason that he couldn't have a vote on a standalone, just to pay the troops kind of thing. But he doesn't want to have the House in session because of Epstein. And so, the walls are kind of closing in on multiple fronts for Johnson. And I think, Schumer and Jeffries being aware of that are kind of willing to let him flail a little bit, and today I've noticed are kind of laying low than they have been in recent days.
Eric says, so the new representative from Arizona needs to bring her family to town. Brilliant solution. By the way, if someone wouldn't mind digging up that clip that Aaron mentioned, of course, it's on Aaron's Blue Sky or Twitter account and sharing that in the comments. That would be awesome. So I want to say I saw a couple of comments on topics that we definitely want to address. One was asking about this Qatari airbase that I think 99.9% of America just learned about this morning, thanks to you, Aaron. And the other is about the Frog Patrol hanging out in Portland protesting ICE. We'll get to both of those topics. I promise. I actually wanted to talk about the frogs for real. But Aaron, one real quick question, and then I have a thought about the shutdown that I wanted to discuss, which is this rescissions package. Would that only take a simple majority in the Senate? Can't be filibustered. Is that right?
Yes, it's a bare majority, and so that's kind of part of the dirty dealing too. Is that for a lot of these bills it takes 60 votes, but then rescissions is just 50. So you could presumably have a you could have a ton of a bipartisan vote on one bill and then just do it on a partisan rescission for the next. So yeah, I mean, so that's part of it too. That it's just a bare majority.
So that perfectly ties into what I wanted to bring up next, which is something that I've also talked about. We've also talked about on past episodes, which is the filibuster, because the Republicans are refusing to touch the filibuster. They obviously have a majority. They can nuke the filibuster if they wanted, and they clearly don't want to. And I think that for the first time this past week, reporters finally really started asking questions about this, and you clipped some of that, Aaron. And, Mike Johnson, not that he has any say in the matter, he was, of course, negative on the idea. And more importantly, John Thune, who is the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell's successor, he said that, we put up with this. What's that?
Can I read the Thune quote? Because it's kind of great. I've got it pulled up. Okay,
I'm glad you have it.
It's really good because so Thune was asked about this today, and he said, quote, if Democrats had won the majority, they probably would have tried to nuke the filibuster. And then you would have had 4 new senators from Puerto Rico and D.C. You'd have a packed Supreme Court. You'd have abortion on demand. And then he went on from there. But it was like kind of a wish list of like everything that we would love to have, more senators, more reproductive rights, less corrupted Supreme Court. So, when I heard that, I had to get that clip out as quickly as possible because it was like, kind of like almost like an SNL skit sort of thing where it's like, yeah, all that sounds, sign me up. That's right. Great.
Don't threaten us with a good time.
Yes, exactly.
But that's awesome. And I'm so glad you mentioned that because I hadn't seen that clip yet. But the other day, he talked about it from a different angle in comments to Punchbowl. And he said that basically, I don't have it in front of me, but that Republicans had to put up with a demand to get rid of the filibuster a lot during Trump's first term from Donald Trump. And it was interesting because he definitely sounded unhappy about that, and he was saying, we're not going to do that. And, basically we stiff armed Trump the last time. If need be, we'll do it again. But I think that, this again gets back to the very simple fact that Republicans seem to refuse to consider, which is that Americans know that they are in control. And your average American doesn't give a fuck about things like the filibuster or 60 vote supermajorities. They just know that Republicans control both chambers of Congress and the White House. And so the fact that Republicans, of course, could pass this right away if they nuke the filibuster, get whatever they
Mhm.
want, and the shutdown immediately. And they won't, because they definitely, as you cited John Thune, they really fear the consequences. And
Mhm.
it also just shows how desperately Democrats need to end the filibuster if they
Mhm.
ever do take back a majority in the Senate.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think, if that ends up being the end game, that Republicans decide either to make it an exception just for CRs, because you can kind of do carve outs of the filibuster,
Right.
or, do something broader than that. I mean, that could be in some ways, I'm not sure if Schumer or Jeffries are thinking on this level of strategy, but, there could be a little bit of a trap that they're setting because, we've talked about this in previous episodes where the filibuster is much more useful for Republicans than it is for Democrats, just given kind of the nature of their priorities. Where Democrats typically have a much more robust legislative agenda, Republicans, most of what they want to do, they can do either with reconciliation or just by nominating judges. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that would be, much more detrimental long term for Republicans. And both Johnson and Thune, obviously are of one mind on that. Now, it has been kind of interesting to me that at least as far as I can recall, and of course, I watch everything that Trump says publicly, and I don't think he's been asked about this at all. And I'd be curious to kind of get his, take on this because it does seem like the sort of thing I could see him kind of impulsively saying, if that's what they got to do, then let's do it, kind of thing. And I mean, that is one of the potential end games here. But again, I think that there's going to be more pressure to find a compromise as there are more kind of real world impacts to the shutdown. It seems like we're kind of on the cusp of that. And, just the sense that, you're going to have a lot of workers not being paid. I saw just before we logged on today that Russ Vogt is now on Twitter in a post that like the layoffs have begun,
Right.
sort of things, which they've threatened. And this has been part of the thing that I think undermined some of the Republican positions over the last week too, is that they have been making all of these threats that they have not followed through on, where they talked this big game about, oh, we're going to restructure government radically because, wow, Democrats, you really messed it up this time. You gave the administration all this power to do whatever they want and they can radically cut spending. And then they didn't really do anything, right? They didn't lay anybody off. And now it seems like, at least if you can go by his post on X, they're doing that. But, both Jeffrey and Schumer have rightfully pointed out that Republicans were doing this anyway. Like they didn't need
Yes.
a
Yes,
shutdown to be
exactly.
firing, to do mass firings of workers. And so, and then, a lot of these constituencies that are most affected, and, I was going to ask you at some point, I don't know if we'll have time to get to it, just if you have any thoughts on either the Virginia debate specifically, which happened last night for the gubernatorial election, or in New Jersey, which happened a few days ago. But obviously there are constituencies in Virginia who are heavily affected because there's a lot of federal workers there. But I get the sense that, and this isn't really based on, I've talked to a couple federal workers. I don't know how broad based the sentiment is, but like, these people have been immiserated for the entire year. I mean, this has been an
Yeah.
awful year for them. I'm sure if they're still, if they still are working in federal jobs, I'm sure it's pretty precarious. You're probably kind of eyeing the exits in a lot of instances anyway. So are they really going to blame Democrats if they're missing paychecks? I don't know. I think it's a little more complicated than that. But anyway, so there are going to be more effects that start accruing the deeper we get into this. And I do think that will put some pressure, even on Dems, to find some sort of compromise. And then I guess the next question is like, what does that look like? What should be acceptable? What would be acceptable to Jeffries and Schumer? I don't have a great sense for that. If it's just kind of a short-term extension of the ACA subsidies, that to me at this point, just personally, I would find that to be kind of insufficient because again, then you're kind of insulating Republicans from the consequences of their own votes that they've taken. So I hope that they push for a little bit more than that. But would you take a short-term extension of the subsidies along with, some sort of guarantee not to do rescissions or impoundment so that the deals that you strike actually are followed through on? It seems like there's, a range of outcomes there. And I'm not exactly sure where to draw that line in terms of what's acceptable or what's not. But I do think this coming week, And now it seems clear that the shutdown is going to drag, obviously, into next week. The pressure is only going to mount on both sides to try to get something done. And then I think it's worth kind of investing some thought in what that should look like, because certainly you want to get some concessions at this point from Republicans.
I think we also have to talk about Donald Trump again. And we mentioned this last week about his essential absenteeism from this entire process. But there is no doubt at this point that he is having serious health issues, both physical and mental. He's having his annual physical this weekend, supposedly, except it's his second physical in 6 months. And that's not annual, last I checked. And what's more, he's doing it at Walter Reed. So why does he have to go to a hospital for this? I mean, he can have any doctor on earth come to the White House. I guess maybe that's routine. But his mental acuity, I think, is even more concerning. And J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois in particular, has been really aggressive on this. And he has started saying he's been unafraid to point this out. And I think a lot of Democrats don't typically like to do this sort of thing because it feels mean. But this isn't mean. This is our country's future is at stake here. And we have a madman who's unwell in the White House. And Pritzker, in particular, started saying today or the other day that he's pointing a finger at Trump's family for basically insulating him or manipulating him or keeping him in office when he's clearly unwell and shouldn't be serving. And it struck me as a pretty potent thing to say. And I don't expect many Democrats to run with that ball as well, but I think they absolutely should because Trump has to be a party to any eventual agreement here too. And if he's unable to or unwell, that's something that Democrats need to point out to say, like, this is why we really can't trust an agreement with these guys.
Yeah, and I think you use the term checked out, which I think is very accurate because, Trump seemed, when he's commented on the shutdown, pretty disinterested in it. Just kind of, he's used the talking about it over and over of like, blame it on the Democrats. It's the Democrats' fault. I mean, something that would have taken like 10 seconds to come up with. And that's pretty much as deep as the nuance goes, or it seems as much as he's really considered it. And, you're right, because, Pritzker, he did an interview with Greg Sargent, and I posted one clip today of it because, as you mentioned, I posted a clip where he talked about how his family should step in. And then Pritzker used the D word, dementia, which I go out of my way not to use, even though people kind of throw that around because, it's like a specific diagnosis. And I don't think we could possibly know that, you're not being his doctor. And so, and it's kind of, it's just kind of loaded, I think, to armchair diagnose someone. But, I mean, I'm sure he used that term with some intentionality. I don't think he's just kind of pulling that out of nowhere. And so, that was interesting to me that he went there with that. And, you're right that the thing with Trump having a physical would be easier to swallow if he hadn't just had one in April, which is weird. And then he was asked about this yesterday, and like, even he seemed to kind of acknowledge that something is wrong because his comments basically amounted to, is basically like, well, I hope everything's okay. I'm going to get checked out for my, I think he said semi-annual or biannual, or used some kind of weird term to allude to the fact that he had been there. So he's not trying to kind of lie to that extent where, oh, no, I wasn't actually there. But then, he used that as an opportunity to kind of pivot to the same rant we've heard a million times about his cognitive test and how he aced it and how Obama never took a cognitive test and Joe Biden didn't even know where he was for 4 years kind of thing. And so, I saw some photos where, obviously he was already there and back at the White House. He has an event in a couple hours on healthcare pricing, where I'm sure he'll talk about lowering healthcare costs by 1,000%, which is obviously not mathematically possible. But I am legitimately curious. We talked about this last week because our last episode was on the 3rd. And there has been this cycle now where late in the month, there's about a week, it's been the last couple months where Trump kind of disappears randomly. And then when he resurfaces, he's got discoloration on his hand, which kind of suggests that there's some sort of medical procedure being done. These are, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not treating Trump, but these are just things I'm observing. And so then, to follow it up a week later with this kind of mysterious trip to Walter Reed, there's clearly something going on. There's something wrong with Trump. He is 80 years old. Your health tends to deteriorate deeper you get in your 70s into your 80s. So I'm not saying that, he's got one foot out the door. When I posted a week ago, just noting that like Trump, he hasn't been seen in public in 5 days. A lot of people got mad at me because it's kind of like, don't get my hopes up. You've posted this before and he's fine. It's like,
Ah,
I'm not saying that anything is,
yeah.
that he's dying or anything like that. It's just a fact that he hasn't been seen in public for 5 days. And so I don't know if we'll know. Obviously, this particular White House is not really in the business of being transparent about Trump's health. We talked in an episode a few weeks ago about, when Carolyn Levitt this past summer unprompted brought up the swollen ankles and the
Oh,
hand.
right.
So, at least in that instance, things were at a point where she felt compelled to comment on it. I don't necessarily expect that in this case, but if Trump got some sort of terrible diagnosis, it would be pretty hard, I think, given how much he's on camera. That's part of his kind of secret sauce, I guess, is that he's on camera all the time. Reporters love it. He's an attention hog. He loves that. It'd be hard to cover up, I think, indefinitely. So, I mean, stay tuned on that. I'm not expecting to learn anything more today, but he is back at the White House now. So if he doesn't know, he will soon in terms of if there's any diagnosis or anything specifically that he learned today during his trip.
So we put a pin in this earlier, but Aaron, I think that you completely startled anyone on social media this morning when you shared that clip of Pete Hegseth talking about this Qatari Emiri facility in Idaho with the was it the Air Force? Um,
Yes.
and I mean, like, of course, the only reaction from any normal person is, "What the fuck are these repressive regimes building a base in the United States?" It's not. Quite that. Basically, as I understand it, because I did a little looking into this after I had to, that the U.S. sells jets to these oil-rich countries because they can actually afford them, despite them being repressive regimes, and Lord only knows who they're going to use them on and how. And so this facility in Idaho was some sort of training facility for the fighter pilots for these small Gulf nations. But this is the kind of thing where I believe it actually the planning for this goes back to the Obama era. But it's the kind of thing where like when people hear about it, just in that top line, it sounds seriously fucked up. And Aaron, did you see that Laura Loomer already flipped her lid about this?
Yes, I did see that. Yeah.
So it's hard to describe what Laura Loomer is. When we would write about her at the Down Ballot a couple of years ago, we just call her far right troll Laura Loomer. But she's evolved into a totally different position. She's some kind of weird, informal, super trusted Trump confidant. There's obviously been also various speculation about the nature of their relationship. And she's a pretty terrifying figure because she alone has managed to get all sorts of people in the national security establishment fired because of
Mhm.
some perceived sin. And she goes and complains about it to Trump or whomever. And, they're gone the next day.
Mhm.
And so Laura Loomer freaked out about this Qatari training site and said, that she might not vote in 2026. And of course, she's histrionic, whatever. But yeah, I think this could be a real amusing thing that people are finding out about all of a sudden.
Yeah, and you actually got me thinking, and I should have brought this up earlier. I intended to when I was thinking through the episode today that one of the big signs to me, and this is kind of related to the Loomer issue where she is kind of speaking out today in a very hyperbolic way. I'm sure she will tone it down in terms of getting back on side with Trump. But her thing was kind of like, oh, the radical Islamists are now, they've got a Air Force base. And because of course she with Mehdi Hassan criticized him endlessly for being like a Qatari shill when he was at Al Jazeera. And so it's kind of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, at least I don't want to give her really any credit, but I mean, I guess at least in that way, there seems to be some sort of principle, even though it's kind of bigoted, obviously. But but
At least
but
it's
kind of
an
along similar
ethos.
lines. I mean, we were talking about Republicans losing the shutdown, and another data point to me that really drove this home, and I'm sure you probably saw clips because I was surprised. I mean, I guess I wasn't surprised, but people were very interested in this yesterday. Was Marjorie Taylor Greene on CNN,
Yes, yes. I'm glad you brought that up.
which like the optics of this were bizarre on so many levels because I knew her as like the crazy Jewish space lasers lady, and like was obviously kind of a gun nut who even after school shootings was kind of shilling for AR-15s and all just we all know the backstory there. But there she was at the CNN set, being way more friendly with the host than most Republicans are. It was not a combative interview. in the slightest. I saw some speculation. Ron Filipowski made this
Well, so
point
hold on,
that
Aaron. I
okay,
want to pause
yeah,
you should fill folks in on what it was that she said.
yes,
Uh,
yes, I should. I was going to get there. Yeah, I was getting
oh,
on a little bit
sorry.
of a tangent there, but anyway, so what she was saying was that um, basically Republicans need to give a little bit on the healthcare subsidies, and that she's hearing from her constituents who can't afford healthcare, and that this is a crisis that is created by Republican legislation, and so therefore she thinks that Republicans should deal with Democrats to at least restore some of the subsidies. And then she talked about the bad advice that Trump is getting, and healthcare was one of them, where she was talking about this can be bad in the midterms, people's healthcare premiums spike. But so anyway, so she was kind of basically sounding like a lib on healthcare, and the interview didn't get deep enough to kind of know what alternative she's proposing beyond just kind of like restoring the subsidies, which there's other problems. The country, which we're however many $37 trillion in debt, like we're going to spend another. I think the yearly estimate was something like 40 billion a year on the subsidies. I mean, it does add up at a certain point when you're cutting taxes at the same time, obviously for wealthy people. But anyway, it was a very bizarre interview because, yeah, I mean, she basically sounded like a lib on the shutdown. She was saying Republicans are to blame for the shutdown. She even had a line that was like, "Look, we control the White House, House, and Senate. Of course, people are blaming us." So it was that I saw a lot of people kind of commenting that like, I feel like we need to take a Tylenol. She's making so much sense here, kind of thing. Which there's a few layers to that joke at this point too,
Yes.
um, but anyway, so I mean, that to me was really kind of reflective of how poorly this is going for Republicans, where someone who's a hardcore Trumper like Marjorie Taylor Greene is basically on the Democrat side on this one. Now, I did see, and this actually checked out as being true to me. It's completely speculation, but this is the sort of thing that would make sense, where I think it was Ron Filipowski who was speculating, I don't know if he had sources for this, but that Marjorie may have had some interest in running for Senate in Georgia and kind of ran that up to the flagpole to Trump. And Trump might have said that he didn't think she was electable statewide, so kind of like stay in the House kind of thing. And that might have kind of, rumpled her feathers a little bit, where now she's, speaking out a little more critically of Trump, or at least kind of there's daylight between them. Because it certainly seemed like kind of a new Marjorie Taylor Greene, where she's trying to be way more sane. And the reason that, this is interesting on a bunch of different levels, because like even with the Epstein stuff, where she has been on the side of signing the discharge position and wanting more transparency, and there was a lot of commentaries around that I tended to be persuaded by, that was kind of part of the broader anti-Semitism that she has, where there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about Epstein and Israel. And, but, this seems to be, the healthcare thing is obviously kind of separate from that. And she seems to be kind of heterodox on that issue too. And, I was even kind of wondering on Epstein, where there's been a lot of speculation that part of the reason Johnson is keeping the House out of session is that he's trying to kind of do backroom deals with either Nancy Mace or Marjorie Taylor Greene. So even when the Arizona rep-elect is sworn in, they won't have 218. I think they just need to flip one.
Yeah.
And Mace still might flip, but it certainly seemed, based on the CNN interview, where Greene again, she restated her calls for transparency, and that she's going to sign a discharge position, that she's not going to flip on that one either. So anyway, I just kind of put that aside. But then on the Loomer topic, that was interesting to me, that she's out there saying, that she's not going to vote, or she's threatening not to vote. No, I did want to ask you, because I saw that you had a follow-up post, below the clip. And I think you already kind of alluded to this, that actually maybe this isn't quite as nefarious and like sinister as it sounds, that, it's not like there's going to be like an exclusive Qatari military base in the U.S. It's more of like a joint. So
Right.
give us some clarity on what's actually going on there.
Yeah, I think that really is that that I'm not a military expert, but they talked what I read, they talked about, it's a bed down facility that these foreign air forces uh, bed down with or embed with the U.S. Air Force for these training purposes. And I think that I also saw that like, well, the U.S. has a big military presence in the Gulf. Why can't they train out there? I believe that I saw that these small Gulf nations are interested in training in the U.S. West because they want terrain that resembles Iran, which is very mountainous, as we all learned with the various airstrikes over the summer. And I guess Idaho and the Mountain West provides a backdrop that is maybe a little bit more similar to what they might expect for what they perceive as their main enemy out west, in the Middle East. But the optics, it just doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
And that's look, the nuance of all of this. I mean, like, that's going to get completely lost for folks on the left. You can oppose this kind of thing simply because why should the U.S. be arming these repressive regimes?
Mhm.
And then for folks on the right, you can oppose it because you're a fucking racist.
Yeah.
And someone asked in comments, you're like, how are the folks in Idaho going to feel about this when they learn? Because I'm sure this one
Mm.
has slipped under the radar. I guess there's a few layers to that one there too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, like, the Idaho's governor, he's going to have to start answering questions about this. It could get unpleasant pretty fast.
Mhm.
The racism will, I'm sure, be unhinged
Mhm.
as always. But it also could wind up being just totally nothing. And it's the outrage of the day, and we'll
Yeah.
move on to something
Well,
tomorrow.
I mean, not to mention, we should at least to kind of have completeness here that, of course, there's been a lot of corrupt dealings with Qatar where they gave Trump a plane. And
Yep.
I'm not, obviously Saudi has been heavily implicated in the crypto. Kushner, got a bunch of money from Saudi, and then there's the whole crypto thing. And I'm not sure where Qatar kind of fits in there, if they've been pumping money into the Trump family as well, or if it's just the jet. But that's kind of the backdrop here too, where it just seems like it's not like a legitimate foreign policy interest necessarily, that it's kind of like they're sort of greasing the skids with giving Trump a plane, and
Yeah.
that it's not on the level. And that was one of these deals where this is kind of how these things work sometimes, where Fox had been teasing, oh, Hegseth is going to make this joint appearance with the Qatari official, and I was kind of like, okay, whatever. And then it was very brief. It's only like a 3-minute thing where they had the cameras there. But as I'm watching, he has a comment about, like, I'm proud to announce today that there's going to be a Qatari Air Force base in Idaho. And it's like, what? Yeah, that was literally
What?
that was the first I had ever
Of
heard of that. So, I
course.
put it out there, and of course it got a huge reaction. And I was grateful that you had done the extra legwork to actually figure out a little bit of what was going on there. This Today I was kind of derailed to the point where because then after that you had Johnson at 2 different press conferences today. And he was also on Fox News. It's been one of those, and then Melania Trump, had a bizarre speech where she was talking about Ukrainian children and this effort that she has been making with both Ukrainian officials and Russian officials to reunite Ukrainian kids who had basically been kidnapped, with their families in Ukraine. But she really had nothing to announce. But then, she slipped in at one point. I had posted this up too, where she was saying, I have an open back channel, or I have an open direct channel with Putin. It kind of left me wondering, like, was that the point of the speech? Was to kind of say that, because it was like one sentence of the speech, but it was like, really, you're talking
What?
directly with, yeah. So anyway, so it was one of those days where I was so busy clipping that I didn't have time to study up on the actual state of affairs with the Qatari base that's
Yeah.
apparently happening in Idaho. But thank you for doing that.
I could totally tell. I'm like, man, Aaron is having a day. How about let me help out here in
Yeah,
in the replies. So, Aaron, I want to change gears entirely
sure.
and talk about something that mentioned in the comments earlier and has genuinely filled me with so much joy this week, that has really just lifted my heart. And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but it is the people in inflatable costumes showing up to protest ice facilities. And if you have not seen the clips of the Portland Frog, they are just absolutely amazing. And I guarantee you will crack up at one of them and then be absolutely horrified at the next one. There is a guy in an inflatable frog outfit looking unbelievably harmless, staring down ice stormtroopers, and he walks toward them in this ridiculous frog suit, and they back away. They slowly back away, and they're like afraid of this guy. And then he starts dry humping the air, and it's like, oh my god! I mean, like, I just lost my mind. And then the ice troops start backing up even further. It's completely wild, and this guy just totally owned them. And then Ice lost its mind. Well, it already has lost its mind, but it went completely nuts. And an Ice Trooper tried to poison this guy because the way that these costumes work, they have an air vent on them that keeps them inflated and also takes in air from the outside so that the user can breathe. And so this ice thug sprayed pepper spray directly on that intake valve. Uh,
Hmm.
it looked borderline murderous to me.
Wow.
But but the Portland Frog was interviewed after, And he said, "Nah, I was fine. I coughed a little bit. There was just like a little peppermint taste." He said, "This was the part that killed me." He said, "I've tasted spicier. I'm Mexican." And there have been all these people showing up in these inflatable costumes, and they've been interviewed, and they've pointed out there's also the chicken guy who just completely mocked the crap out of Christine Ohm. And the chicken guy said, when you see people showing up looking ridiculous like this, it completely deflates the claim by the fascists that there's
Yeah.
some kind of insurrection going on here. And I think that's really important. Like I said, it's filled me with joy to see these people. There's going to be another massive No Kings rally a week from tomorrow,
Yeah.
so I'm definitely going to attend. You can just Google No Kings. It'll be the first link that comes up. It'll show you where to go. But yeah, just taking the piss out of these fascist thugs, I just think is a really effective tactic.
Yeah. And I saw that last night in Portland. The inflatables were kind of multiplying, where there were many
Yes.
of them last
Yep.
night. So that is, yeah, it is kind of a brilliant, it sort of highlights some of the absurdity. Now, the one thing on a slightly more serious note that has been probably, I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that it really seemed to be a concerted thing from Republicans today of kind of framing peaceful protest as terrorism. Like this
Yep.
was Tom Emmer, who, is a
Yeah.
Minnesota rep, obviously the big Trumper, although he criticized Trump for January 6th. Like there have been kind of moments of daylight more years ago now, but he specifically referred to like the pro-terror wing of the Democratic Party that's turning out for the No Kings. Johnson on two different occasions today talked about how the protesters are going to be pro-Hamas and Antifa. Of course, Antifa, Trump is trying to designate that as a terrorist organization. So that is something that I'm really kind of starting to be alarmed by, is that there seems to be a concerted effort by Republicans to criminalize peaceful protests. And, you mentioned, I wish I had not heard about that until you brought it up, the gassing of, one of these inflatables. I mean, that's an example where, that should be protected behavior, especially if it's nonviolent, obviously. And by all accounts, this was in Portland. And, if you're assaulting protesters, like that's a violation of your right to assembly and your right to speak. So, that is really concerning in terms of like, being watchful to do what we can to resist authoritarianism. Certainly the pretexts are kind of being laid today, where Senator Roger Marshall, who was on Newsmax, and he invoked a lot of the tropes about like, oh, the pro-Hamas terrorists or the pro-Hamas protesters and Antifa that's going to be out next week. We're going to have to bring in the National Guard, and I hope it stays peaceful. I doubt it. It's basically his direct quote where, he was kind of like almost suggesting there needs to be like a military crackdown on these protesters. And so I am concerned about that. So I think, that it kind of underlines the need for the protests to be really large and really peaceful. And, for all the legitimate horrors that are being inflicted upon people by ICE, and there's been reports this week of ICE shooting people. Of course, they had like this, raid that they did. That was like a military style operation, apartment building last week,
Yep.
where they were zip tying kids and, detaining people based on their race and things like this. Like, it can be hard to respond to stuff like that peacefully, because obviously, you're being attacked if you're one of the people targeted. Here, the situation in Portland's a little bit different on the ICE facility, where people are coming out to protest. But, whenever possible, I think that is kind of the optimal way to protest, is to be, kind of like aggressively peaceful, so that if anything happens to you, it's very clear who the aggressor was. And that's one of the upside, for all of the downsides that we could talk about of social media, like the fact that people can film everything, get it on the internet, so there's transparency about what's happening. That's obviously going to be key next weekend as well. And, if Blue Sky is any indication, which is obviously a very left-wing space, but some of the comments that Republicans are making today about these protests next weekend seem to be really backfiring, where I saw a lot of people kind of saying like, this is all the more reason to get your friends, go out, do it. Like, it's going to be important that people turn out. So, I echo that as well. I think, there's strength in numbers with situations like this. And we'll have another opportunity next week to talk about this, because the protest, I believe, is the 18th, which is next
Yep.
weekend. So we'll have one more show before then. But there seems to be, it's notable to me how worried Republicans seem to be about these protests, or at least like kind of fixated on them in a way that
Yeah.
even for me, it's like, okay, there's been a few different protests. I know King's one in June was obviously a big one, surrounding the military parade in DC, and there were all sorts of offshoots, including here in Minnesota. But, Republicans are the ones who keep bringing this up over and over again, like it's some kind of seminal moment. So it does kind of lead me to wonder like what could happen. But, let's hope that people turn out peacefully and that it just kind of reinforces the reality that Trump is not popular, that this authoritarian takeover is not popular, and that for all the agita that we've had this year about Democrats kind of being on the impotent or kind of demoralized, that the resistance was demoralized. This could be really kind of a galvanizing moment to kind of show that there are a lot of people like-minded who are upset with the direction of the country, and they're going to get out there and protest and make their voices be heard.
We'll finish with one last question from David Neer, who I swear is not a sock puppet of mine.
Okay.
David asks whether it makes more sense to hold one giant rally in DC or distributed rallies throughout the country. And I'm not an organizer of such things, but the last time the No Kings rallies were held, the organizers felt that it was important not to have an official rally in DC and to have them all across the country. And that made a lot of sense to me. For safety reasons, but also, Aaron, like you just said, strength in numbers. It's so important. And, this has been shown in every way, all kinds of studies by, social scientists, that when someone takes a stand for something, it makes it much easier for the next person to do so and for the next person after that. And you get a critical mass. And so I think having these protests in every corner of the country, it makes it much more accessible. Obviously, you can have far more people than would be able to travel to DC, and it just encourages more people to join. The more people that join, the more people will join. And I think that's what we're going to see. I think that's why Republicans are obsessed with this and fixated on this. If you do go, be very safe, be very smart. There are all kinds of guides about how to protect yourself and how to protest safely. As Aaron says, be just, it sounds like a funny phrase, but be aggressively peaceful. And again, that's why the inflatable costume protesters are so awesome. Because how can you? There's nowhere to hide a weapon. You can only move very slowly. I'm not saying. Well, you know what? I am saying everyone go buy an inflatable frog costume. It would be awesome. What's really funny, Aaron? This is the last thing I'll say about this. My colleague Daniel Donner at the Down Ballot, he's been tracking the apparent sales numbers of the frog costume on Amazon, and because Amazon says like 100 sold recently, 200 sold recently, every day it keeps going up. So there is a frog movement. We are reclaiming Pepe from the fascists.
There you go.
So everyone, if you're going to go to No Kings, be safe, be smart, but have fun.
Yeah, and then you can kind of get a 2-for-1 too, because then Halloween's coming up. So you can be the inflatable for the protests, and then a couple weeks later, you can break it back out for trick-or-treating with your kids, or when you're giving out candy at your home, or whatever the case may be. So, we'll have a chance to talk about that again next week, and I'm sure we'll circle back on the shutdown and, see what the state of play is then. Then we'll see if, Trump has Ebola or something before then as well.
Jesus Christ.
Trying to think of something that isn't like too realistic, but, of course, the Ebola scare did kind of help Trump, that his movement in 2014 and 15. So maybe that's a topic for another episode. Yeah, we're not going to open that can of worms here. But 1,200 people tuning in today. Thanks to everyone for doing that. And we didn't even have a chance today. Like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Virginia and New Jersey debates, but maybe there'll be an occasion down the line. And if you want to hear what David has to say about those debates and other down ballot races, please subscribe to the Down Ballot, support our work. David and his team are doing absolutely fantastic work covering all of the races below the presidency. And of course, those 2 gubernatorial races being, kind of top of mind this year, which is obviously kind of an off-cycle year. And, there was kind of the bizarre scandal, which again, we didn't have time to get into with the AG candidate in Virginia and the text messages that he sent. I'm assuming you guys probably had some coverage of that this week, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, there's so much going on with all these races. I think that what we'll do, I've been thinking about this in the back of my mind. I think we should do a preview maybe on the last episode before Election Day, and we'll sort of sum up all the big developments. Because one thing I want to emphasize, it's important never to get hung up on just one particular story. Things can move really, really quickly. It already feels like people might be moving on from that AG story because Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican candidate, had a real meltdown in the debate last night with Adam Hamburger, the Democrat. Oh, yeah. I'll send you some clips after this. Wow, clips that I've seen that you haven't. This is a
Yeah,
first.
I had to be
But
offline last night, so I missed it. And then, for reasons that we already talked about during the show, today has been so crazy that I've just been kind of reeling from one,
of course,
Republican press hit to the next. But and Trump still, like I said, has his drug pricing event this afternoon, so it never stops for me.
it never
But thank
stops.
you for everyone who tuned in today. We had a great audience, a lot of questions, which is always kind of fun to engage with. And we'll see everybody a week from today, same time, same place.